What is it that you hope to achieve in your visit to what we regard as the home of the technology industry here in Silicon Valley in San Francisco?
Thank you, Ed, and thank you for having me on. This visit is a great opportunity to connect with important stakeholders on behalf of the European Union. So meeting with public authorities such as the California Privacy Protection Agency, the Department of Consumer Affairs, meeting with a range of companies in the private sector, a lot of big tech companies in Silicon Valley, AI companies. So the focus is on consumer protection, data protection, the protection of children online, which you know is a hot topic here as well, and also highlighting the work that we are doing within the European Union to make the EU economy attractive for investment, showing the efforts we are making to be more supportive of innovation. I recently brought forward to the European Commission a proposal for a fundamental overhaul of EU company law. So we'll be setting up a new EU Inc. form of company, in effect a harmonised set of corporate law rules across the European Union for a single entity. So these are all efforts to improve the overall competitiveness of the European economy. So I'm also bringing that message and yes, explaining our approach to regulation, which is a balanced approach to appropriate regulation on the one hand, but that must be balanced with support for innovation.
That's probably
in the tech sector.
The biggest consideration for the companies themselves, or point of contention, right? I believe you met with OpenAI's CEO Sam Altman.
I did.
And to an extent, those meetings are behind closed doors. But what is it that Mr. Altman asked of you? The way that we always think about the European Union is it's more than 450 million people, many of which may or may not access that technology or OpenAI's products.
Yeah, and the European single market is a fantastic market for US companies in the same way it is for European companies and other non-EU and non-American companies. 450 million people, 27 different countries. And what we hear back from big tech and from AI companies is that they want certainty, they want stability around policy and regulation.
Certainty meaning codified rules?
They want to know what the rule book is,
yes,
and they want it applied consistently across the European Union. And that is something we agree with, because while we are a union of 27 member states, when the EU introduces new EU law, then that must be applied in a coherent and a cohesive way across the European Union. So that's what I hear back from big tech. But we had a good discussion with OpenAI about the economic impact of AI, also the issue of the impact on democracy, how we address issues like deepfakes, how we address the huge challenge of non-consensual sexual content that is generated and disseminated, how we better protect children in the online environment and the role that AI can play. So we recognise in the European Union that AI has enormous transformative potential, which is already delivering and being played out, but equally there are risks, and that's why we do have to balance the technological innovation of AI with an appropriate set of guardrails that protect the fundamental rights of citizens and support innovation.
I do want to specifically talk about child safety, but before we get to that as a topic, generally, do you see US technology leaders as engaging seriously with European regulation, or basically managing their obligations to it? That is, I think, what industry is trying to work out, is whether these are sets of rules that they do take seriously and abide by, or they just get frustrated by, given the volume or the body of regulation from the Union.
Yeah, I have to say we do have really good engagement with the US big tech companies. Yes, they take issue with certain aspects of regulation and they share their perspective on that, but they want to be compliant and they want to stay within the rules. And from our point of view, we want the rules to be very clear and transparent to support innovation and investment within the European Union and help us to improve the overall productivity of the European economy. And so in the same way that a European company has to comply with US regulation when it's doing business here, of course we expect that US companies doing business in Europe in the same way that European companies operating in Europe must comply with the rule book. But the rule book has to be fair, it has to be proportionate, it has to be consistently applied, and that's why we have been examining it in the round, and we have been bringing forward certain reforms and amendments that do take account of some of the criticisms, and some of them perhaps have been fair and have had some basis to them. But
so that makes the Digital Fairness Act, Commissioner, an interesting case study, because the European Union would argue, or the Commission would argue, that it could cut red tape. It would allow you to get things done. Business leaders might say, well, it's another piece of regulation on top of DSA and DMA that if you're a technology company, you have to take into account. Who's right?
Yeah, we hear that criticism, but we can address that, I think, in a very open and direct manner, because the Digital Fairness Act is not designed to be an extra layer of regulation. It doesn't reopen or revisit existing rules. What it seeks to do is address any remaining gaps in the area of consumer protection in the online environment. So, yes, it will deal with issues like dark patterns and addictive design features, difficulties consumers have in cancelling subscriptions at times, the role of social media influencers, for example. And we have collated all of the evidence. We've engaged in intensive negotiations and discussions with all of our key partners, and we will later on this year finalise the Digital Fairness Act proposal. But it will be balanced, and it will address remaining gaps rather than representing an additional layer. But what it will also do is address fragmentation, because, again, what we hear from the business community is they want one rule book that applies across the European Union. And we have the potential to deliver that on these issues through the Digital Fairness Act. Otherwise, you get lots of different national initiatives which can result in a patchwork quilt of regulation that US companies and other companies trading within the European Union have to deal with. So I think it can be pro-business as well as being pro-consumer.
The consumer protection story in this country is about social media and addiction presently. That kind of plays out through the courts, really, in the United States. Consumer protection is a big part of your portfolio. Yeah. How are you defining what is or is not a product, a social media platform or a set of tools within it, as being deliberately or willfully designed to be addictive? That's incredibly hard to define.
Yeah, but that's why we have our Digital Services Act, and we have complemented that with a set of other legislative interventions, such as the AI Act. We have the Political Advertising Regulation. We have the Digital Markets Act. And we have within the European Union a well-established rule book now, which is clear and transparent, and which sets the guardrails within which companies then can freely operate.
Does it go as far as making a product which is designed to play on a user's behaviour as illegal? Does it take that step?
So what the DSA, the Digital Services Act, does is it imposes obligations on the platforms that are within its scope to mitigate the systemic risk caused by the content and the dissemination of the content on their platform, relating to issues like democracy, the protection of children online, for example, issues around product safety. So it does address addictive design, but only insofar as the platforms that are within its scope. And that's one of the issues that the Digital Fairness Act will seek to address, is to close the gap, because, for example, the Digital Services Act imposes a prohibition on the targeted advertising directed at children based on their profiling. But that only applies to the platforms that are within its scope. But we think that really should apply across the board to the online providers. And so that's an issue we're examining within the Digital Fairness Act. So it's an example of how we are focusing on any remaining gaps in child protection and consumer protection in the online environment through the vehicle of the Digital Fairness Act.
Commissioner McGrath, in the context of child safety, I'm trying to understand the direction of travel that Europe as a whole is taking. President Macron, for example, is an advocate for limits on minors' usage of various platforms, technologies. Is that where Europe's heading? And within the existing legislation, the existing rule book, to what extent are you prepared to sort of force changes to a platform's underlying technology, to its algorithm, to recommendations, if you believe that the net result is improved child safety?
Yeah, so we've done a lot already, is the first point I would make, through the Digital Services Act and other interventions. And there are actions underway by the European Commission against some big tech firms in relation to their obligations to protect children online. So that is already there. But it is an open question that we are considering about whether we need to go further and do more. So the Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, set up an expert group who will report back in the next short number of months. They are examining that very question around age limits that may be appropriate for children to be on social media.
These age limits have been explored in different jurisdictions around the world.
That's right. But alongside that, only yesterday we confirmed that the technical work on a new EU age verification app has been concluded. So EVP Henry Verkunnen and President von der Leyen confirmed that yesterday. We also have an existing code of conduct that many big tech firms have signed up to, but we have not closed the door on doing more, and we will await the outcome of the work of the expert group. We expect to have it during the summer, and then we will decide whether to bring forward a proposal for additional EU regulation that may further address that issue of age.
Right.
But I have to say there are different views within the EU, as there are here in the United States, because we do believe in investment in digital literacy. Technology is the future. We want young people to embrace it, to be part of it, to enjoy all of the benefits. But there are risks, and we do need to protect them in the online environment. And that's why we are examining the need to do more.
Commissioner, to end our conversation, you've outlined a really constructive and busy schedule with, frankly, the most important people in industry in this part of the world, right? But from our political leaders in particular, the narrative, I suppose, painted is that the US accuses Europe of putting in place rules that target its biggest tech companies. Do you feel that is frustration is reflected in the meetings you're having with industry? And if it were not to be the case, what evidence would you put forward that that's not true, that it is constructive in its nature?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly not true, because the rule book that we have applies to European companies, to Chinese companies, in the same way that it does to US companies. So it is without fear or favour, and it is with a view to protecting consumers, protecting online users, and especially protecting children in the online environment. And what we hear from companies all the time is that they want clarity and certainty about the EU rule book. They want it consistently applied. They want it, of course, to be fair and proportionate. We believe we can deliver all of that while at the same time ensuring that we have a safe environment online that protects consumer rights and that protects children in the online environment. So we continue to engage with them in the same way we continue to engage with the US administration, and we are focused on implementing the commitments that we made as part of the EU-US joint statement that was agreed last summer, and we act in good faith. We deliver on our commitments, and of course we expect our partners to do likewise.